Most people remember David for facing Goliath. Fewer remember the moment he had the throne within reach and refused to take it. He had already been anointed. Saul was hunting him. The opportunity was real. And yet David would not seize by force what God had promised to give in his own time. That is what makes this story so confronting, because many people say they trust God until they finally get the chance to take with their own hands what they were told to wait for. There is a kind of faith that is easy to admire because everyone can see it. It is public. It is bold. It looks like courage out in the open. It looks like David standing in front of a giant while everyone else is afraid. But there is another kind of faith that is tested when no crowd is watching, when the shortcut appears, when the promise feels close enough to grab, when the outcome seems justified, when you finally have the power to move things forward yourself. That is the test many people fail, because it is one thing to trust God when you still have no power. It is another thing to trust Him when you finally do. That is where David becomes dangerous for us, not because he killed a giant, but because later, when the crown looked reachable, he still refused to take it the wrong way. So this story does not begin in the cave. It begins in 1 Samuel 16. Saul is still king. The throne still belongs to him in public. The nation still recognizes him. And yet God has already rejected him. Samuel goes to Jesse's house. The obvious sons pass before him. The impressive ones are rejected. And the one nobody thought to bring first, the youngest, the forgotten one, the one still in the field, is the one God chooses. David is anointed. Oil is poured on his head. The Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him. And yet nothing changes outwardly in that moment. No throne, no crown. No public transfer of rule. No immediate possession. David is chosen by God and then he goes back to obscurity. That alone confronts a lot of people. Because many want calling without hidden years. They want promise without delay. They want divine selection to mean immediate possession. But David was anointed long before he was enthroned. He was chosen before he was recognized. And that gap between promise and fulfillment is where this story gets sharp. Then comes Goliath. And yes, that matters. David's courage there was real. He trusted the Lord when others trembled. He ran forward when everyone else stepped back. That was genuine faith. But Goliath was not the deepest test of David's heart. It was the visible test. The more dangerous test came later. After the victory, David is pulled into Saul's orbit. He rises. He succeeds. He is loved by the people. Jonathan binds himself to him in friendship. And Saul begins to fear him. What first looks like favor becomes danger. Saul throws spears. Saul surrounds houses. Saul hunts David into the wilderness. The king who should have blessed him uses power to destroy him. And now the tension changes. David is no longer only the shepherd who killed a giant. He is the anointed man living under a real promise, while being pursued by the king whose place he is destined to take. That is not a small burden to carry, because David is not waiting in peace. He is waiting under injustice. He is waiting while being hunted. He is waiting while the current king grows more unstable and more violent. And that is exactly where shortcuts become tempting. Because once delay becomes painful, people start excusing methods they once would have feared. Once injustice lasts long enough, force begins to look practical. Once the promise feels delayed long enough, people begin telling themselves that maybe God expects them to finish the job with their own hands. That is the pressure inside 1 Samuel 24. Saul enters the cave alone. David and his men are hidden in the dark. The man who has hunted him is suddenly exposed. The king who made his life miserable is right there. No army, no battlefield. No noise, just opportunity. And David's men do not merely call it a chance. They frame it as providence. They interpret the opening as if God himself has handed Saul over. That matters because temptation often comes wearing spiritual language. It does not always say, do evil. Sometimes it says, this is your moment. This is what God is doing. This is the answer. It all lines up now. If your heart already wants the outcome badly enough, you will call the shortcut confirmation. David moves close enough to Saul to strike. This is not symbolic. He is close enough to end the story right there. Close enough to stop the chase. Close enough to step over the body of the current king and into the future he already knows was promised. But he does not kill him. He cuts off the corner of Saul's robe, and even that troubles his conscience. That detail is crucial. David's conscience is alive to the holiness of the moment in a way his men do not understand. They see necessity. David sees the Lord. They see access. David sees a boundary. They see a justified end. David sees a forbidden path. And then he says the words that govern the whole passage. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him. Inside this story, that means something serious. David is not saying Saul is righteous. He is not denying Saul's corruption. He is not pretending Saul deserves what he is doing. He is saying that God's promise to him does not give him the right to fulfill that promise through an act God has not authorized. That is the point. The promise is real, but the method still matters. The throne is truly his in God's purpose, but it is not his to seize by murder. That is what makes this story so sharp, because many people can believe in God's promise as long as the path stays slow and abstract. What exposes them is the moment they can actually force the outcome. David refuses to do that. He will not use a wrong means to obtain a right end. He will not turn a true promise into permission for disobedience. He will not grab early what God intends to give later. And this is where the story has to be handled carefully. The lesson is not that godly people never act. The lesson is not that waiting always means passivity. David was not passive. This is the same man who ran toward Goliath. He had already proven courage. So his restraint in the cave is not fear of action. It is submission to God. That is what gives it weight. David was not weak. He had courage. He had men. He had access. He had reason. He had pain. He had opportunity. And still he refused. Then he walks out and confronts Saul, not with blood on his hands, but with a torn piece of robe. That moment is powerful because it proves David could have acted. He was not waiting because he was unable. He was waiting because he feared the Lord more than he desired the crown. That is real restraint. And if 1 Samuel 24 stood alone, someone might still say maybe David only hesitated once. Maybe the moment was unusual. Maybe it was an exception. But then 1 Samuel 26 comes, and the same principle appears again. Again, Saul is vulnerable. Again, David has access. Again, someone near David urges him to end it. Again, the shortcut is there. Again, David refuses. That repetition matters because it proves this was not an accident. It was conviction. It was principle. It was a pattern in David's heart. He would not take by force what God had promised to give. And when Saul finally dies, David still does not rush ahead with self-importance. In 2 Samuel 2, he inquires of the Lord. Even after the threat is gone, he still seeks direction. Then the kingdom comes in stages. Judah first. All Israel later. Again, not all at once. Again, not through seizure. Again, through God's order, not David's impatience. That should already confront the modern believer, because many people say they trust God as long as trust still feels noble. But once delay becomes costly, once injustice becomes personal, once the thing they want finally comes within reach, trust becomes much harder. And that is why the cave is not just part of David's story. It is a pattern in ours. The cave is the place where opportunity arrives before permission. The cave is the moment when the result you desire becomes reachable through means you know you should not use. The cave is where a person discovers whether he wants God's will or only God's result. That is the real question. Do you want what God promised in the way God gives it? Or do you only want the outcome badly enough to call your shortcut obedience? That is where faith is tested. Many people think faith is proven only in public courage, but Scripture shows something harder. Sometimes faith is proven by what you refuse to take, not whether you can fight, but whether you can hold back, not whether you can move, but whether you can refuse the wrong move when it finally becomes possible. That is harder for many people because restraint feels like loss, especially when they have already suffered, especially when the person in front of them is clearly wrong, especially when everyone around them says the moment has come. And that is why this story is not mainly about monarchy. It is about the heart before God. Will you trust God enough to let Him remain sovereign over timing and method? Or do you only trust Him enough to name the destination while taking control of the road yourself? That is the exposure. People do this with ambition, with leadership, with ministry, with relationships, with recognition, with vindication, with influence, with the need to finally possess what they believe should be theirs. They tell themselves that because the desire is not entirely wrong, the way they pursue it must therefore be acceptable too. But David's story destroys that excuse. A true promise does not sanctify a false shortcut. A real calling does not authorize self-seizing. A future God may truly intend to give, still does not become yours to grab through disobedience. That is why David's story is so dangerous, because he was not only patient in the abstract, he was obedient under provocation. He was restrained under injustice. He was governed by the fear of God when the shortcut looked completely defensible. That is spiritual maturity. And maybe that is where this has to become personal. Some of you are not first being tested by lack. You are being tested by opportunity. Not by a closed door, but by a door you know how to force. Not by powerlessness, but by the arrival of just enough power to take what you want. That is where your theology becomes visible. Because what you do when the shortcut appears says more than what you say while waiting. It shows whether you love righteousness more than a rival. It shows whether you want the promise more than you want to honor the one who promised it. David feared the Lord more than he desired the crown. That is why he could walk away from what looked reachable. And that is why this story cannot end as admiration. It has to end as confrontation. What are you trying to take early? What are you trying to secure by force? What path are you excusing because the outcome feels holy enough? Where have you started calling access permission? Where have you confused impatience with faith? Because many people say they trust God, until they finally get the chance to take with their own hands what they were told to wait for. That is where faith breaks for many, not in the valley, in the cave. So hear the point clearly. David did not become king when he was anointed, and when he finally had the chance to force the issue, he refused. Not because the promise was false, but because it was true. And precisely because it was true, he would not dishonor God to obtain it. That is the warning, and that is the hope. The warning is that not every path to the promised thing is faithful. The hope is that God does not fail his word. He gave David the throne without David needing to seize it by violence. He fulfilled what he had promised without requiring David to break reverence in order to obtain it. So do not call the shortcut faith. Do not call impatience obedience. Do not call self-seizing trust. If God has truly spoken, then his timing matters. His boundaries matter. His way matters. And sometimes the clearest proof that you trust him is not that you move faster. It is that you refuse to take what you could have taken, because you fear the Lord more than you desire the result.